Welcome back, everybody. Short ride number 29 today. And I did a series on the world champions that I had wrestled. And this was the first guy in the series. I went back and started with the oldest champion, NWA champions. These are all NWA champions. I wrestled champions that held other belts. But these are the NWA guys that I wrestled. And this one is, definitely one of the greatest of all of them. Probably won the belt as many times as any of them did. Kept it as long as anybody ever did, probably. And it's Thesz. And this is really gives you a great idea about what a fantastic athlete Thesz was. And I hope you're going to enjoy this story. This was one of my first that I wrestled, maybe one of the best, if not the best. So here we go. Short ride number 29, Thesz.
Welcome in David Summers with the Tennessee Stud Ron Fuller and the very first episode of Stud Stories. Okay, Stud, you wrestled a long time with some really talented individuals. 11 NWA champions. Maybe not all of them were champions when you wrestled them. Maybe they were in the past, or maybe they were going to be in the future, but you really wrestled some very gifted individuals. So let's talk about some of those incredible matches with some of these gifted individuals.
Yeah, I want to welcome, first of all, Dave, all of the great fans, man, that are out there on Southeastern Rewind. And I've been wanting to do some special things and tell some stories. And I kind of want to tell some stories. I guess this is the first one that we're going to be doing in a long series of them. And every once in a while, when I feel like it, I'm going to go and tell another one. But I've always wanted to talk to the fans about the matches I had with NWA world champions. Some of them were champions when I wrestled. Some weren't champions. Some were in their prime, and some were far past their prime. You know, I think it's an interesting subject matter, and I'm going to have a lot of fun doing it. And I hope fans out there on Southeastern Rewind are going to enjoy listening to them. And you're exactly right. We're going to be talking about, in my 17-year career, I wrestled 11 NWA champions. Either they were champions when I wrestled them, or maybe they weren't at that point. You know, this series of Stud Stories, you know, I'm going to discuss one champion for every story. And then I'll give a brief history of each, obviously. And I want to talk a little bit about how long they were champions. What was their wrestling style like? Discuss the actual match or maybe matches I had with them. In some cases, and in most cases, convey a personal story or two about each of them when possible.
Yeah.
These NWA champion Stud Stories are going to be on Southeastern Rewind channel, not every week, as I just said, but every once in a while. When I feel like it, I want to throw one on there for fans, and I think and I hope that they really enjoy them. If I see that the numbers are good and there's a lot of viewership, we'll crack them out maybe a little more often. Obviously, out there, if you're listening to me today, I hope you're going to enjoy this. This is kind of a part, I consider this to be a part of my family's wrestling history. And I'm really proud to be able to share this with all of the great old school fans out there listening. Let's start back with the National Wrestling Alliance. Before we even talk about the first world champion I want to have conversation about, the National Wrestling Alliance was formed in 1948, which happens to be my birthday. And the year I was born, it was an organization of individual wrestling promoters that were basically willing to share a world champion. Never been done before. And that made it the first of its kind, the National Wrestling Alliance. And it would become not just a National Wrestling Alliance of promoters and owners from across the country, but around the world. So, it's going to be quite a few years in the process of being there and having these great champions that represented the National Wrestling Alliance, all the promoters of that company. And I was proud to be one, got to be one myself in 1975, right after, within months of establishing my first company, Southeastern Wrestling. I was made an application to be a member and was obviously accepted pretty quickly. since my father and my grandfather have been members before me. So I'm proud to say my grandfather, speaking of him, Roy Welch, was one of the original founders of the National Wrestling Alliance. The first NWA champion. And a lot of people probably don't recognize this name, but we're going to go back to 1948. It was a guy named Orville Brown. And he held the belt for almost 2 years, starting in 1948. He was the first champion of the National Wrestling Alliance, and he held it almost to the end of 1949. So, by golly, let's just dive into some real wrestling history with the NWA World Champions. This is my stud story number 1. And we're going to start with a guy named, and this name is going to freak you out a little bit, Dave. It did me because I really wasn't aware of it until lately. This guy's name was Aloysius Martin.
Wait, that's the name of a champion?
That's his real name. Okay. Aloysius Martin. Can you figure out who that could be, man?
If way back that far,
yeah,
I'm going to throw it.
1949. He wins the title in 1949.
One of the greatest ever, Thesz.
Attaboy.
Wow.
Okay. Man. But is Aloysius Martin a long way from Thesz?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I would have never picked that up on the street. No.
Yeah, no. And I mean, Thesz, I don't even know how he came up with the name of Thesz. I mean, that is enough, but I can see why he changed his name. That makes sense. So, so Lou won the title from Orville Brown on November 27th, 1949. And he held the belt. This is on his first run. He has several runs as world champion. He held the belt on his first run for almost 6 years straight. And Thesz was considered by many the greatest NWA champion of all time. And he's going to be off and on. He's going to be champion off and on for more than 10 years total time. He was trained by two wrestlers. One guy was named George Tragos. He was a very much feared freestyle Greek wrestler. And way back in the day, obviously, this is back actually before the 1930s. So Tragos was around, and then there was another one named Ray Steele. Both of these guys were kind of in the St. Louis area, and so they trained him in freestyle. Tragos trained him in some shooting. Ray Steele more in the professional style, and they trained him for about 4 years, man, which is pretty long time to be trained before you ever get a shot in the ring.
Wow.
It's kind of similar to my grandfather Roy in his dealings with the great old timer out there in the West, the Dutch Mantel, the original Dutch Mantel. So Lou has his first professional match in 1932. So you guessed the other one pretty good. How old do you figure he was in his first professional match?
I would have to say he was in his 20s, but I don't know if that adds up.
He was 16 years old.
Are you kidding? Wow.
16 years old when he got in the ring in St. Louis in 1930.
Just a boy. Okay. Yeah.
Just a boy.
Yeah.
Just a boy. But gosh, a really talented, obviously, boy to be able for a professional company to put him in the ring at that point. So, and as a pro, he got managed by one of the best wrestlers of all time, one of the best professionals of all time, Ed Strangler Lewis, who was just a phenomenal wrestler, phenomenal athlete, a big, huge guy for back in his time frame in the 20s, a huge star in the 20s and into the 30s. And he managed and he helped train Lou some, especially once Lou became a professional. And this same Ed Strangler Lewis actually worked with my father a lot when Dad was a young wrestler too. He was a real good friend of my grandfather Roy, and they went back a long way, obviously. So Lou's getting the training by some tremendous talent, that's for sure. And now he's being managed as a young pro by maybe the greatest wrestler of all time, or one of the greatest, and who was a big-time manager for many, many years after he was no longer able to wrestle. And that was the great Ed Strangler Lewis. And during Lou's illustrious career, he wrestled at least 11 members of my family alone. And that's a pretty big statement right there, have a big enough family that 11 of them wrestled Lou Thesz in his career.
Yeah.
I'm going to name off those because I don't always tell a lot about my family members. Some of them's names may not be as familiar as others, but obviously he wrestled Roy. He wrestled against Herb. He wrestled against Roy and Herb's brother, Jack. It was about the same age as Roy and Herb was. Then Lester is the fourth in that first generation of professional wrestlers. And Lester's about 20 years younger than Roy. He's actually close to my father's age. So he wrestled the first generation entirely, Roy, Herb, Jack, and Lester. Then he wrestled my dad, who was wrestled his buddy, Fuller, obviously. And then he wrestled the three Fields brothers, who were my granddad's sister's children, okay? And their name was Bobby and Lee and Don Fields, the Fields brothers. Then I wrestled him. Then he wrestled my brother Robert. And then he wrestled my cousin Jimmy. So, and besides 11 of them being guys that he wrestled, 7 of those people I mentioned were owners of territories. So, we've been around a long time. We had a lot of experience in the ring, and a lot of us had experience far beyond just the ring itself. So he was not the NWA champion when I wrestled him. I said that would be the case for some of these world champions that we're going to be talking about in these stud stories. And I had 3 matches with him in my career. Lou Thesz was a recognized great shooter. And when you locked up with him, you could tell. He just had that feel about him that the grip and everything else that just it got your attention instantly that this guy's no normal wrestler, and most wrestlers I'm sure were like me. First time I went in the ring with him, they were extremely nervous to get in the ring with Lou Thesz. And when I wrestled him, he was probably in his 50s. And before my first match with him, my grandfather's brother Herb, I talked to Herb a couple days before the match, and he was asking me, well, who you been wrestling and what's going on? And I said, well, I'm supposed to wrestle Thesz in 2 nights from now. It's a couple of days later.
Mm-hmm.
And Herb had some advice for me.
I bet.
Yeah, because he had wrestled him many, many times. No telling how many times Herb had wrestled him. But Herb said to me, he says, Ron, you need to watch his wrist lock, And so I was like, well, wait a minute, I said, well, why his wrist lock? Of all the moves that he's got and all the things he's likely to do to me, why would you focus on his wrist lock? And he said, because if you don't, Ron, because when he reaches and gets that wrist lock, he said, he'll have your arm in front of your body. And he says, if you're ready or not, he's going to just go straight backwards. And if you bend your head forward and roll over, you might keep from breaking your arm or tearing your shoulder out.
Ooh, okay.
But if you don't, Ron, he goes, he's going to bury you face first in the mat, and then he's going to run that wrist lock behind your back and up your back, and he says it may be over right there.
Yeah, it could be.
so and then he says you need to expect he's got a hell of a grip, and after wrestling him the first time, I likened his grip to Danny Hodges. It felt like when he grabbed a hold of you, like he had the grip of a Hodge. And wow, we've talked about it many times. Danny Hodge used to take the apple and just catch it in his hand and squeeze it into pulp. And
Wow.
break the handles out of steel wire pliers, and I mean, just an unbelievable grip. And Thesz had a lot of that same grip about him. And, but the difference between Danny Hodge and Lou Thesz is Danny grew up a great amateur wrestler, but was not so knowledgeable about professional wrestling and how to really hurt you. He didn't have that shooter background that Lou had. Lou knew how to hurt you. And, wow. You didn't want to mess with Lou. You didn't want to mess with Danny either, but you certainly didn't want to mess with Lou. So, and then I got one other quick story here, man, and this one comes from the late 1960s when I was at the University of Miami playing basketball still, and Lou Thesz came on the Johnny Carson show, which was really popular back in the 70s, late 60s. Johnny Carson show was the big thing at night.
Absolutely.
Ed McMahon, his big co-host, Ed McMahon.
You are correct.
Yes. Yeah, about twice the size of Johnny, right?
Right, exactly, yeah.
So, me and the boys are sitting there, like we did, all college students at night, watching TV, and NBC, I think it was, the old Johnny Carson network, they said, hey, Lou Thesz is going to be on the Johnny Carson show a couple of days later. So, wow, when it came time for the show to be on, the living room in the dorm I was in filled up. Not just me, but all of my buddies. They wanted to see how Lou was going to do on TV, and so did I.
Yeah.
So, I'd met Lou several years earlier through my grandfather, once with my grandfather and several times around my dad, and Lou knew who I was.
Yeah.
But, he, at this point, he was a major, major star in wrestling. And I was kind of really hoping, man, that old Lou was going to make me proud in front of all my buddies here, that they weren't going to say something or do something to Lou to make professional wrestling look bad.
Right.
And that used to be the thing back in those days. It was kind of common that people thought, oh, it's all a big joke. And but Lou had a different whole presence and everything else. People treated him with respect. So I looked it up on Google when I started thinking about this. I thought I want to tell this story about, and the date of this episode was May 18th, 1968. And it was in my third year of college. Mm-hmm. And on this show, Lou was so classy, man. He dressed great. He always wore the suits. He just had an aura about him, man, that the believability. And he and Johnny had the conversation like they normally do. He sat down at the seat there next to the desk with Carson, and down on the end of the couch was Ed McMahon. It was this, that was the scenario of the old days. And for those fans that saw the Carson show, they know exactly what I'm talking about. And for those that didn't, maybe get a little idea, Johnny Carson's a tremendous star in the country. One of the biggest names ever, right, Dave? I mean,
yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So, he has a nice little conversation with Lou. And then, he says to Lou out of the clear blue, he goes, well, a lot of people don't really believe the wrestling is real. And he goes, and they see you guys pick each other up and slam each other and all that stuff. And he goes, how about, I wouldn't ask you to slam me, he says, because, I don't weigh very much. But he says, Ed McMahon there weighs more than 200 pounds, and he's a pretty big guy. Hey, could you slam Ed McMahon?
Here it comes.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And Carson used to do this to poor old Ed McMahon a lot. And Ed McMahon obviously starts right away. No. I believe he can do it. You don't have to show me, So anyway, Lou gets up, and he takes off his suit coat and he lays it over the couch. And McMahon don't want to get up, and Carson, come on, Ed, he's not going to slam you, he's not going to drop you, he's just going to pick you up. And so finally Ed gets up off the couch and he Lou And so I'm thinking, now, I know Lou's strong as heck, but Ed McMahon was a very big guy.
Yeah.
He was probably 6'4",
Yeah. Yeah.
and he probably weighed 250, more like 250 than 200.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, geez, I don't know about this, because if someone knows what you're going to do to them and you're going to try to pick them up to slam them, they have a tendency to back up and throw their weight down toward their rear end.
Right.
And it makes it harder for you to get them up.
Yeah.
They can block it. It's kind of like they don't go up there real easy. They kind of block it so that you can't pick them up. It's a natural tendency. And and I'm wondering, now, how's Lou going to deal with this? And so he's talking to Johnny Carson, and he's standing face to face with Ed McMahon, and he's looking over to Johnny, and he's saying to Johnny, he says there's a way to do this that's easier than normal, and he's very calm. You don't know he's got anything in mind, and then he's looking at Carson, and he looks back at Ed McMahon, and just the second that he looks at him, he reaches over and takes the heel of his hand, and he pops Ed McMahon in the forehead like a little tap, pow. And Ed McMahon's head snaps back a little bit, and it throws him off guard, and he reaches right in there, and he picks him up. Right, he's got him right up in the air.
Wow.
Ed McMahon it was like that, just like that. I mean, every one of those boys in that room with me were like, wow, look at that. Jeez. They couldn't believe that he could do it that fast. But, he was a smart dude, and he knew how to set McMahon up, and he made it look simple. He made it look easy. It was a big night for me. I remember the guys were like, gosh, Ron, man, this is amazing, man. Didn't have any idea these guys were this strong.
Yeah.
So, a little odd story, but it just happened to remember when I was thinking about doing this first one on Lou Thesz. So to finish this up, obviously Lou had a lot of class. Maybe one of the classiest world champions of all time. I think Flair dressed kind of like him, and Flair tried to emulate him, but it was hard to do that. Lou always was dressed in a suit, and he always looked like a world champion.
Yeah.
And I think many NWA champions that followed him, like I said, like Flair, they tried to emulate Lou. I mean, he was the role model for world heavyweight champions. And he was one of, not just for the world champions, but he was a great role model for every wrestler. Basically, from about the 1930s all the way into the 1980s, he was still in the ring.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he had a tremendously long career. He was considered to be one of the last true shooters in professional wrestling.
Yep.
And a lot of people described him as a quintessential athlete, man. I mean, he was basically a polished warrior, man. He could break a guy in two if you pushed him in the wrong direction, if you tried him.
Yeah.
It was like, oh, no, you don't want to mess with him, man.
Yeah.
So Lou lived until he died in 2002. And like I said at the beginning of this, he was widely regarded as one of the greatest wrestlers of all time, and maybe the single greatest world champion in history. He was the last accepted world champion in Japan that the people really believed in, And in Japan, he was known as the god of wrestling. That's basically, they had a word for it. I couldn't pronounce it, but if you talk Lou Thesz, they had the word for Lou, and I finally asked JoJo, the interpreter over in Japan, when I was there in '83. What is that they're calling Lou Thesz? And he says, the god of wrestling.
Whoa.
So, and he really was. And he went over there and wrestled Ricky Dozan and some of the greatest wrestlers that Japan had. And obviously, I bet you every time he left there, they had more respect for him than they had when he came. And he, by himself, probably had more to do with the growth of National Wrestling Alliance than any other wrestler in history. So, Dave, this is the first one, a little stud story, and I hope everybody out there has enjoyed this story. And I'm going to do one on all 11 the NWA World Champions that I had the opportunity to be in the ring with, and each one of them was going to have his own stud story.
Cool.
And the next one, as a matter of fact, is going to be about a wrestler I wrestled in Southeastern in 1976. He was born in New Zealand. His name was Pat O'Connor, and he had just as big a part in advancing the popularity of the National Wrestling Alliance World Champion as Thesz did, in my opinion. Pat O'Connor was a tremendous athlete who actually invented several wrestling moves that will never be forgotten. They're still used today. One of them was named after him, called the O'Connor Roll. And it's just, you've seen it. People see it in every match, just about in the old days. Sooner or later, in just about all matches, you're going to see that O'Connor Roll. So, and he happened to be a personal friend of mine, and one of the guys that really took me under his wing in 1973 when I started going to St. Louis and wrestling in the biggest and most famous wrestling city in the world, practically every other weekend in 73 and 74. So it's Pat O'Connor in the next one, and thank everybody out there for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this stud story, and we got a lot more of them coming in the future.
Well, that about says it all. I mean, wow, it's a pretty comprehensive little deal on Thesz, and I really enjoyed doing it. It brought back a lot of memories for me. A lot of history there. I actually went and studied quite a bit of things, found out things that I never knew about Lou before doing this, but. He was definitely a classic NWA World Champion. Actually, he was the first NWA World Champion when they formed the company and when the National Wrestling Alliance was formed. So, and if you, we're going to be doing some more of these, and if you would like to take a look at them, man, they're going to be for you, open and available for you at ClassicContinentalWrestling.com. And be sure to jump on there and see them. It's $4.99 a month to $39.99 a year annually, and it's going to be the best old time in old school wrestling podcast and streaming channel on anywhere in the world. And thank you very much for your support, continued support, and we're going to bring in another one.